Welcome our panelists. We're going to now turn the floor over to you. If you would like to pose a question to anyone or all of our panelists, please find your way to one of the two microphones in the center of the room. And the Assistant Secretary is going to help me. Deb and I are going to be moderating. And so the floor is open. Do we have any questions?
You should offer a prize to the first person who stands
The prize to the first brave person. I think you're right.
dessert.
And it would be from the home state of Tennessee. Hello, Karen Carson.
Hello, Madam President. Karen Carson from Tennessee. I guess one of the questions, I think we've had moments that have changed our country. Columbine changed security for schools. 9/11 changed security for our country and airports. And I think Sandy Hook has changed security for our schools. One thing that we're grappling with is there is no industry standard for school security. Is there any intent in developing an industry standard? In our community, you know, we understand that we can't make everybody go away. But we do believe that having an industry standard of what type of cameras, you know, should you have? What type of systems should you have in place would be helpful. So, you know, I'm not sure, is there any group, organization, department that is working on developing that industry standard?
Yeah, I'll jump in, then I also want to have you talk about the standards around school resource officers, which I think is really critical. But from the department standpoint, because of the whole context of local control, we're not into mandating or setting out regulations that are more from a legal standpoint. But we actually have a website, our REM website, which actually gives out guidance. So when I talked about the school emergency management plans, they're very exhaustive. So they give out guidelines from best practices that we've utilized from Department of Justice, Homeland Security, et cetera, on you know, even when you're building new schools, where the offices should be located, you know, safety measures, et cetera, what kinds of training should occur. How do you intersect with the local police department? What kind of communications do you give out to parents? What kind of training that you do? And I think if you recall this, I was struck by the first grade teacher in Sandy Hook who had placed her students and kept them safe in the bathroom in the classroom. And it resonated with me because I was a second grade teacher at one point in my career, and I was thinking, I don't know if I would have the wherewithal to have done that. But clearly what resonated with me is that there was probably a lot of practice that occurred in various situations. So the timing is really critical and the essential kind of planning. So that's all on the REM website. And I don't know if you've given that out, but you could certainly provide a link that give out to all of the members. But I think one of the big questions that's come up around the safety resource school resource officers.
Yeah, let me just piggyback on what the Undersecretary said with regards to the role of school resource officers. That is not a subject that is without controversy. There is certainly has been expressed concerns about what should the role of the police be in education. And we've sort of taken a line that I think it was from the teachers union that talked about this idea that the officers needed to be woven into the fabric of the school life. They should not be there simply to enforce the law. They should not be there to bring the power of the state to enforce, in effect, administrative processes within the school, but should be a critical part of developing that whole overall school plan that the Undersecretary talked about. One of the requirements that we're looking at for the comprehensive school safety plan, which is proposed for the President's proposal for fiscal year 2014, is to actually set standards, to develop standards and best practices for what school resource officers should do, how they should be integrated into the school system, and actually make that part of the grant requirements as we go forward. Not just recommendations, but requirements that you actually adhere to those best practices as part of receiving those grants.
I'd like to chime in on that. First, I want to thank you for the question. I think school security is absolutely on everyone's mind. I think we really need to be cautious when we talk about security, particularly hardware, like surveillance cameras and metal detectors. We want to be very data-driven. The data are not terribly supportive of those measures regarding, they're somewhat non-significant or non-conclusive outcomes regarding the actual objective impact on safety. What we do know is that it fairly consistently has a negative impact on perceptions of school safety among students and among staff. What that does is it undermines learning, and it makes students and staff feel guarded. And so I think it's, when you do your local and state level advocacy, it's important to really consider and look at the data.
Another question?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. I've got a broad question and a question underneath it. And I'm Scott Wagness. I'm with the District 15 PTA in Louisville, Kentucky. In a big picture, how would you assess, how would you rank the safety of our schools today? And I know that's incredibly broad, but what would you say is like the number one need for schools today?
Why don't you
Bill?
take that?
Yeah. You and I have the same thought.
The number one need today for schools is really simple. It's trusting relationships between the people that are at the school. Trusting relationships between the students and the adults. And the confidence from parents that schools are going to do everything humanly possible to protect their kids. But hardware, cameras, metal detectors, locked doors, resource officers, they all have a role to play, but they do not even come close to having great teachers in every classroom. Teachers that the kids know not only they can teach and the learning process is going on, but they can trust personally with their concerns. Because we live in a very impersonal world. So the more personal connections we can make, that's the number one priority.
Just to piggyback on that, if I might, I was a police chief for 13 years out in California before I came here. And I used to tell people with all sincerity that I was not the number one public safety official in the community. Number one public safety official was the superintendent of the school. Because that is
I wish you were my police chief and I was superintendent.
Because exactly what you said, this idea about relationships on campus. And I remember sitting on an interview panel one time we were awarding scholarships for high school students. And it was a high school that had a reputation for being particularly rough. And I asked the student, do you feel safe on campus? And he said, yes, I do, which surprised me a little bit. And then he followed up, he said, I know where not to go. And I think one of the concerns that those relationships that you're talking about are absolutely critical for is that ought not to be the definition of safety. It absolutely ought to be this idea that if something is untoward, if something is threatening, that whether it's the school resource officer or the teacher or the custodian or whoever it is, that student has a network to call on.
Yeah, and I'll add, I know there's a number of questions, but research has shown that when students actually feel safe and connected in school, they feel that they belong, they feel a sense of ownership on the safety of the school, they're more likely to tell someone. Whereas in most cases where there have been multiple homicides in schools, there has been some verbal indication of a risk, but that other student didn't tell anybody. Right. And so we know that if we create a connected place where they feel they belong, that is probably, I agree, really the number one piece of that.
Marnie, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. My name is Marnie Usher. I'm from Connecticut. So as you can imagine, a lot of these questions we are really grappling with, and our state legislature is grappling with them. And at the hearing, some of the things that I have heard consistently is the need for more people dealing with mental health in the schools themselves, that there aren't enough guidance counselors, there aren't enough school psychiatrists. What can we do to help facilitate that need?
I'll jump in and then you can speak. But one of the things, so you should become really familiar with the requirements within your own state. Most states have, and I don't know if you know the actual average, but most states have an incredible ratio. I want you to think about this. If you are asked as a school counselor or school psychologist to work and impact the lives of students, and you have a ratio of 1 to, in our state, it was 700 students. How do you make that connection, or how do you do that? If you're in smaller schools, you're lucky if you have a full-time individual within that school or somebody. So the first is you've got to become very familiar with it, and then you've got to understand when budget reductions come, and we're not living in really flush times here, what are the choices that are made? When I said that we tell our kids, what we offer to our kids tells them what it is we value, these decisions around budgets are incredible. So when professional development gets cut to think about creating safe, nurturing environments for schools, that diminishes what we offer to our kids. When we're saying that we want everybody to engage in the mental health vitality of our students and we cut those essential positions, that makes a statement to our kids. So becoming familiar, being advocates for our kids in the mental health space. Because I think too often we just figure out, well, it'll just take care of itself naturally. And it doesn't. I mean, our kids are grappling, and they always have. I could think of kids when I was growing up who obviously had some really serious challenges. But it's just complicated even by this economy. I've heard teachers who have been in relatively wealthy communities where things were taken for granted and their families have just been disrupted by the economic recession. And these kids are struggling. They're struggling. And all of the things that we place under that school, on the principal's shoulders, on the teachers, are only exacerbated by the economy and the recession. So I think you've got to become familiar and be a strong advocate for professional development and for mental health workers in schools, and for programs. You know, we cut art, and yet art is an essential ingredient into an art therapy program. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop.
Well,
Obviously, I'm passionate about this.
Assistant Secretary Delisle was talking about ratios, and our ratios are somewhat abysmal, and they range. For counselors, the recommended ratio is 1 school counselor to every 250 students. For school psychologists, it's 1 to every 500, 700 students. I know for school psychologists, we're on average about 1 to every 1,500 students. Some places it's 4,000 to 5,000. I personally was in a district where I had 3 schools, and I was itinerant, working out of closets. So again, the access to mental health services is critical, and I think they do more than what we all think of having an individual student who is in need of some kind of intensive services, because the mental health professionals such as school social workers, school counselors, school psychologists, we can help with the other things that contribute to school safety. Effective discipline policies, need assessment, bullying prevention, school safety and crisis preparedness, response, and recovery.